I walked out of my son's Christmas dinner without saying a word, and the next morning I called my attorney and had my entire estate rewritten. That was 14 months ago. I don't regret a single thing. But let me back up, because if I start there, you won't understand why it mattered so much. You won't understand how a woman who spent 40 years building something from nothing could stand in her own son's hallway on Christmas Eve and feel like a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. My name doesn't matter as much as my story does. What matters is that I'm 67 years old. I live alone in the house I've owned since 1989, and I raised one child, a son, by myself after his father left when the boy was 4. I worked double shifts at a medical billing office for 16 years. I skipped vacations. I drove a car with a cracked dashboard until my son graduated college. I did what mothers do. I didn't expect a parade. I just expected basic human decency. His name is my son, and that's what I'll call him. He's 41 now. He married his wife. I'll call her my daughter-in-law 6 years ago, and from the very beginning something was off between us. I couldn't name it at first. She was perfectly pleasant at the wedding, smiled in all the photos, called me by my first name immediately, which I thought was a little forward, but I let it go. I told myself that was just how younger people were now. The first year of their marriage, I saw them about once a month. We'd have dinner at a restaurant, nothing fancy, and we'd talk the way families talk, about work, about the house they were fixing up, about maybe someday having children. It was fine. Not warm, exactly, but fine. Then my son came to me in the spring of their second year together and asked me for money. He was careful about how he said it. He said they'd found an opportunity, a small commercial property they wanted to buy and rent out. He said it was an investment, not a handout. He said they just needed a bridge loan, something to cover the gap between what the bank would give them and the full purchase price. He said he'd have it back to me within 18 months. The amount was $55,000. I want to be honest with you, I hesitated. Not because I didn't have it. I did, just barely, because I'd been careful my whole life, but because something in the back of my mind said, wait. My son could see it on my face, and he said, Mom, you know I'm good for it. And I believed him. He was my son. I wrote the check. 18 months came and went. I didn't bring it up. I told myself he'd mention it when he was ready. 2 years passed. I still didn't say anything. I was afraid of making it awkward. I was afraid of the look I might get from my daughter-in-law. I was afraid, if I'm being honest, of being seen as the kind of mother who puts money ahead of her child. So I stayed quiet, and I kept showing up. Sunday dinners, when I was invited. Holidays. I always brought something. A dish, a bottle of wine, flowers for the table. I always offered to help clean up. I always tried to be easy, to be low maintenance, to be the kind of mother-in-law you actually want around. I'm not sure it ever worked. My daughter-in-law had a way of making me feel like I was slightly in the way. It wasn't anything she said outright. At least not in those early years. It was more like a temperature. When I walked into a room she was in, the temperature dropped 2 degrees. She'd turn slightly away when I spoke. She'd answer my questions with the minimum number of words possible. Once, I brought over a casserole, my son's favorite, the one his grandmother used to make, and I heard her say to him in the kitchen, just loud enough that I might catch it, I really wish she'd call before she just shows up with things. I had called. I'd called that morning. I started to wonder if I was imagining it. You do that at a certain age. You've been told enough times that you're too sensitive, too needy, too much, that you start to audit yourself constantly. Was I dropping by too often? Was I offering opinions no one asked for? Was I holding on too tight? I talked to my closest friend about it, a woman I've known since our children were in grade school together, and she said, Honey, you're not imagining anything. You're just a mother who loves her son, and some women can't tolerate that. I appreciated her saying it. I'm still not sure I fully believed it. The commercial property deal, by the way, had apparently not gone as planned. My son mentioned it once, obliquely, about 3 years in. He said the tenant had backed out and they'd had to sell. I nodded. I waited to see if he'd say anything about the money. He didn't. I let it go. I kept letting things go. That was my specialty, apparently. Then this past December, my son and his wife hosted Christmas Eve dinner for the first time. They'd just finished renovating their home, the same home I'd inadvertently helped finance, and my daughter-in-law was very proud of it. She'd spent months on the interior: new kitchen, new floors, built-in bookshelves in the living room. It really was beautiful, I'll give her that. I arrived at 6 o'clock, the time my son had told me to come. I brought a pecan pie, from scratch, his grandmother's recipe, and a bottle of good bourbon and gifts for them both. My daughter-in-law's sister and her husband were already there, along with a couple my son knew from his office. 6 adults total, including me. I walked in, I set my things down, I hugged my son. My daughter-in-law was in the kitchen. I went to say hello to her, to offer to help. She turned around, looked at me, not at me exactly, more through me, and said, "Oh, you're here already." I said yes, I was right on time. She smiled the way people smile when they're not actually smiling and said, "Well, we're still getting things ready." She turned back to the counter. I went and sat in the living room with the others. I introduced myself. I was pleasant. I asked the office couple where they were from. I admired the sisters' earrings. I was doing everything right, the way I always tried to do everything right. Dinner was served around 7:30. The food was good. My daughter-in-law is a capable cook. I complimented the roast and I meant it. We talked about the holidays, about travel, about some television show I'd never seen. My son was relaxed, happy, refilling everyone's wine. I thought, this is fine. This is actually fine. Then the sister made some comment. I don't even remember what it was about. And my daughter-in-law laughed and said something back, and then turned to the table and said, in that bright social voice that carries across a room, "You know, this is actually the first Christmas I've been able to host my family the way I've always wanted to." She looked around the table with this glow of satisfaction. Just the people who really belong here. There was a pause, one of those pauses where everyone can hear the thing that wasn't quite said. I kept my face still. I picked up my wine glass. Then she looked directly at me and said, pleasantly, as if she were saying something perfectly ordinary, "No offense, but this dinner was really meant for closer family. I'm sure you understand." The table went quiet. I heard the sister clear her throat. The office couple became very interested in their plates. I looked at my son. He was looking at his wine glass. I set my napkin on the table. I stood up. I said, "Of course, I understand completely." I went and got my coat from the front closet. I picked up my purse. I left the pecan pie on their counter because I couldn't carry everything, and I didn't want to make a scene reaching for it. I walked out of that house, and I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen in my coat for a long time before I took it off. My son called at 10:42 p.m. I know the time because I looked at my phone when it rang and I made the decision not to answer it. He called again the next morning. I let that one go too. On December 26th, he sent a text that said, "Mom, I hope you understand that wasn't meant the way it came out. Diane just gets stressed about hosting. Can we talk?" I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen table and I called my attorney. I want to be clear about something. I didn't call my attorney in a rage. I wasn't shaking. I had actually slept well, better than I had in months. And I got up that morning and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window watching the birds at the feeder I'd put up in October, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I could see things clearly. The $55,000 was never coming back. I knew that now. I'd known it for a while but hadn't let myself say it plainly. More than that, I'd spent 6 years adjusting myself, shrinking myself, arriving on time and leaving before I overstayed, bringing gifts and not expecting acknowledgement, swallowing hurt after hurt because I didn't want to lose access to my son. And what had it gotten me? A seat at a table where the hostess could inform me, in front of strangers, that I didn't quite belong. I'd been paying for the privilege of being tolerated. My attorney has known me for 20 years. He's helped me with my late mother's estate, the deed on my house, a small dispute with a contractor. When I told him what I wanted to do, he didn't try to talk me out of it. He asked a few careful questions. He said, "Are you sure this is what you want, and not just a reaction to something that happened?" I said, "I'm sure it's both, and I'm sure both are fine. I had a will that left everything to my son. The house, which is paid off and worth just over $400,000 now. My savings, my life insurance, a small investment account I'd built up over the years. I changed all of it. I directed the bulk of my estate to 3 organizations. A children's literacy nonprofit in my city that I'd been quietly donating to for years, a hospice foundation that had cared for my mother, and a scholarship fund at the community college where I'd taken night classes in my 30s when I was trying to get ahead. I kept one provision for my son. A specific bequest of $10,000 with a note in the documentation that it represented symbolic acknowledgement, nothing more. My attorney asked about grandchildren. I didn't have any yet, but I told him, if that ever changed, I would like any grandchildren to have access to an education fund administered independently, not through my son, not through my daughter-in-law. He said he could set that up as a contingent provision. We did. I signed the new documents on December 28th, 2 days after my son's text. On January 3rd, my son called again. This time I answered. He was careful at first. He said he was sorry I'd felt hurt. He said his wife hadn't meant it the way it came out. He said the holidays were stressful and things got said, and could we please move forward? I listened to all of it. When he was done, I said, I've moved forward. I'd like you to know that I've revised my will. There was silence. I said, I want you to hear it from me rather than find out later. The silence lasted a long time. Then he said, quietly, I told him. More silence. Then, Mom, you can't be serious. I said I was completely serious and that I'd been thinking about it calmly for over a week. He said, because of one dinner? Because Diane said something awkward? I said, no, because of 6 years. The dinner was just the last one. He started to say something about the $55,000. I think he was going to tell me that was different, that was business, that had nothing to do with this. I said, I'm not calling it a debt. I made a gift, and I'm at peace with it. But I'm also at peace with what I've decided. He got quiet again. Then he said, Diane was right. You've always been vindictive. I said, I hope you have a good new year, and I ended the call. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It did. He's my son. He's been my son since the moment I first held him in a hospital room in February of 1983, when there was no one else in the world I cared about as much. That doesn't stop being true just because you've had to make a hard decision. Love and wisdom are not the same thing, and sometimes you have to choose wisdom even when it costs you something. The weeks after that were strange, quiet in a way that took some getting used to. I cooked dinner for one, which I'd been doing for years, but it felt different. Not lonely exactly, more intentional. I started going to a Saturday morning lecture series at the public library that I'd meant to attend for years and always had some reason not to. I started calling my friend more. I started sleeping through the night again, which I hadn't done consistently in longer than I could remember. My son did not reach out for 2 months. In March, I got a letter, an actual handwritten letter, which surprised me. That was mostly about how hurt he was, but at the end had one line that I've read several times since. I think I owe you an apology I don't yet know how to give. I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure what the right response is. I'm not closing the door, but I'm not holding it open so wide that anyone can walk through uninvited. My daughter-in-law has not contacted me. I don't expect her to. People ask me. And I've had several friends ask me this, whether I think I was too harsh, whether changing a will over a dinner was an overreaction. I understand why they ask. From the outside, it might look sudden, but here's what I know. The dinner wasn't the reason. The dinner was the moment I stopped being able to pretend. There's a difference, and it matters. I gave my son everything I had for the first 20 years of his life, and everything I could spare for the 20 years after that. I gave him $55,000 I worked for and never saw again. I gave him 6 years of swallowing my own feelings so he could have peace in his marriage. I am 67 years old, and I am not going to give him my death, too. The literacy nonprofit sent me a thank you letter in January when I updated my planned giving information with them. It said that gifts like mine helped ensure children in under-resourced schools had access to books through their elementary years. I printed it out and put it on my refrigerator. The Hospice Foundation called to tell me that my increased bequest would be put toward a family comfort fund. a program that helps cover costs for families sitting vigil with dying loved ones who can't afford to take unpaid leave from work. The Community College Scholarship goes to first-generation students who are working while enrolled. My mother would have approved of all three. She was a practical woman who believed that money ought to do something useful in the world. She also believed, and she said this to me more than once while she was alive, that dignity was not something other people could give you. You either kept it for yourself or you gave it away a little at a time until there was none left. I kept mine. Last month, I went on a trip I'd been putting off for 9 years. A 10-day tour through Ireland and Scotland that a friend of mine had been trying to convince me to take since we were both in our late 50s. I stood on a cliff in County Clare on a Tuesday afternoon with the wind absolutely screaming off the Atlantic, and I laughed out loud, alone, because the whole thing was so big and so beautiful, and I hadn't expected to feel as free as I did. I brought back shortbread in a tin decorated with Highland cattle, and I gave it to the woman at my attorney's office who'd been kind to me the morning I came in to sign the new documents. Small thing. But she'd made me a cup of tea without being asked, and I hadn't forgotten it. This is not a story about hating my son. I want to be clear about that, even now. This is a story about understanding, finally, what you're worth and deciding to act accordingly. It took me longer than it should have, but I got there. I wasn't lonely that Christmas night when I sat in my kitchen in my coat. I was just done, and done, as it turned out, was the beginning of something.